Thank you all for joining us today for this article in the Forestry Source. Samantha Gill is one of our editors on the Forestry Source. And Samantha, can you introduce ourselves and our speakers today?
Yeah, I'm Samantha Gill. As Morgan mentioned, I'm one of the associate editors. I'm also a professor of forest management and measurements at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. So Kristin, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Kristin Leachman. I'm a painter in Los Angeles, California, and I have been working on a project called 50 Forests in forests around the country. I started in California, and I've now been working on one for the Georgia Museum of Art and a longleaf pine forest in West Georgia.
All right, and Jeffrey, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jeff, Richmond-Moll. I'm the curator of American art at the Georgia Museum of Art. We're on the campus of the University of Georgia. And as Kristin mentioned, we've been working with her on this very exciting exhibition that will open here next July of 2022. And the exhibition will be called Kristin Leachman Longleaf Lines.
All right. Kristin, can you please tell us how you got started on this project?
Well, the whole project started in California forests in around 2010. It sort of picked up steam around 2012. I started taking all of my research that I had done in the San Gabriel National Forests and all forests throughout the state, all the way up to the Mendocino National Forest. I did a residency at Yosemite with some of the last remaining black oak groves left in the state. And then after that, it became apparent that I would really like to keep working on it throughout the country. So I had discovered the longleaf pine forests and approached Jeff, and we sort of, worked on it back and forth. And then, in I guess early June in 2020, I was actually able to locate a forest and get permission to go in it. And it's under private ownership. And that's where I did most of my research. It's about 1,000 acres of old growth longleaf pine with a really rich history. And that was another part that really interested me in all these forests, was the connection and overlap with important American history. So I'm probably halfway through creating the paintings for the show that will, as Jeff mentioned, will be in July.
All right, great. And from your description of the project that you shared with me, you state that it's designed to reflect on the interspecies relationships between trees and people. But from what I've seen, none of your images, none of your paintings have any people in them. So how do you see your paintings getting to the relationship between trees and people?
Well, for instance, the paintings I've created in Georgia, studying the history, including the current conversation I had with the head of the Lower Creek tribe, on with the landowner, researching the history of slavery on the property, different people who had been part of the whole turpentine industry. If you look at those paintings, what's been apparent to me is that they're all, and it's nothing that's altered, but the paintings are all reflecting the different skin tones of everybody who's been related to this connection to this forest since a recorded time, from the indigenous people to the African Americans to the whites, and on down. I think that's been kind of an interesting piece and something I've really tried to research along the way through old photographs and just a lot of reading and researching.
All right, this this question is kind of a follow-up, and it may be for either one of you. When the paintings are displayed at the museum, or in fact any museum for that matter, will there be little excerpts like what you just said about the skin tones of people or the history?
So we're still working on exactly what the didactics will include. Those are conversations we'll be having over the next 6 to 8 months as the planning comes together. But the didactic component of the project in terms of wall texts and other educational elements, I mean, they'll absolutely need to address these histories of longleaf pine. I think one thing that Samantha, you mentioned before we started that you had never really seen a longleaf pine forest in person. And I think a lot of these old growth forests are inaccessible to the general public because they're on private land today. And so we're really having to do a lot of things to introduce the visitor into this kind of environment with not just this kind of immersive quality of Kristin's paintings, which bring you so close to the surface of the trees, in the way that they reflect these patterns on the bark, but also, what are the histories of these places? Kristin mentioned turpentine farming and histories of enslaved labor in the South. There's also the history of these forests in relation to the railroad and clear cutting longleaf forests for railroad ties, and this is where the title longleaf lines kind of takes on a different dimension too if we think about rail lines in these trees. So this is kind of all part of the big story that we plan to build around the paintings in the gallery, and then through associated programming with colleagues on our campus at the University of Georgia at the Warnell School of Forestry, our School of Ecology, and the State Botanical Gardens are here in Athens, Georgia. So we'll lean on colleagues there as well to be thinking about all of these bigger stories that relate to the pictures.
All right, Jeffrey, how did you get involved in this project to begin with?
An email from Kristin. I think, Kristin, you heard about me from a colleague. I had worked with 2 curators on a project called Nature's Nation, American Art and Environment, which was organized by the Princeton University Art Museum. And so my interest is in part, one of them in my work is in the relationship between environmental history and art history, and how we can think about those ideas when we look at a work of art. What sort of environmental attitudes are reflected within it? What was the ecological context in which the painting was made? What is the painting made of? Which I think maybe is something we can get back to with Kristin too, if we think about the pigments that paintings are made from, and what are the environmental ramifications of what art materials are made of. So this was something that I've been working on for a little while, and Kristin reached out to me and shared this project, which, as I said, brings together so much of what we have here on campus at the University of Georgia in our community. And really, one of our missions as a museum, which is a history of the art of the American South. So I was glad to get that message from Kristin when she reached out.
And it's also very interesting that a lot of school children, especially Southern school children, they know more about the Amazon rainforest than they do about the longleaf pine forest, which of course has, almost as complex of an ecosystem. But again, as he mentioned, they are a lot on private land. So it's not as accessible as, there isn't a longleaf national park, for instance, right? So it's hard to get kids in there to study it. I'm sure it's not impossible, but it's not as easy. It was difficult for me to get in, for instance, and I'm only one person. And there is the issue of, the ecosystem is very fragile. So would you be able to, truck in a lot of people and preserve the habitat? I'm not clear, but I thought that was a pretty interesting study that was done. And I'm hoping that through this and through all the different projects I work on, that will be a real benefit for the public, is that I'm bringing a conversation to people that needs to be had, and things that need to be highlighted that are, right in their own neighborhoods.
Right. How many states have you currently been to as part of your 50 forest project?
I've been to 4 so far. And I have had, I'm having this exhibition. I had an exhibition at the Laguna Art Museum in California. So my hope is that at each state that there'll be an exhibition opportunity, so that there's that outreach.
Great. If the longleaf pine paintings are part 2 of your project, was part 1 Laguna?
Part 1 was Laguna.
Okay.
And I'm working on Virginia and Tennessee and a bit of West Virginia at the moment as well, just in the research stages. And Montana.
Great.
And then there's also this connection with the longleaf forest, because when the northern lumbermen ran out of white pine around the Great Lakes, that's when they came down and started timbering the longleaf. So, there's all these overlaps of these forests where they run out of resources in one and they move to another. And then there's things like the Civil War, like Jeff mentioned, where land in the South became so cheap that they were able to come in, the railroad barons, and just clear cut it.
So I think you already answered my next question, which was how many parts will there be? So you're hoping to have 50 different parts to this project?
I am.
Do you plan on going to any of the territories in addition to the states?
I hope so. I hope so. I'm open to that. I think what's very interesting is when you start to dive into different states, it's, there's all these different opportunities. And then some forests obviously are not contained in one little state. Maybe there's a strip that runs through 4 or 5 states. So I'm working on that too. And I'm pretty open and fluid. So some of them may be multiple state exhibitions where I do 4 states in one show, that sort of thing. So I'm open to sort of how the trees will direct it, right? On how it unfolds.
Great. So you state that the project will take place in various forested and unforested sites. But what are you planning on painting for the unforested sites?
Well, I think for an example, like the Great Shelter Belt, right, where it isn't necessarily a thick, dense forest, but FDR had planted a series of trees clumped together to save the Midwest from blowing away in the Dust Bowl. So we're talking from Oklahoma all the way up through Kansas, Nebraska, Panhandle, everywhere up there, sort of vertical. That's something I've been researching, and that isn't obviously in appearance the way Yosemite would be, right? Or a giant part of the Smokies. So it's, again, letting the trees determine how the story unfolds. But for me, the story is paramount, right? It's using the trees to tell the story of the country, of climate change, and doing it through art.
All right. Jeffrey, what do you hope visitors to the Georgia Museum of Art will take away from viewing this exhibit?
Well, I think when I talk to our museum studies students or other students on campus, I think exhibitions always have to have multiple takeaways for different levels of visitors. So I think, on one basic level, it's again this, immersing the visitor in this really unfamiliar but quite immediate, quite close by landscape in their own state and region, and trying to help recover some sense of what was, this massive forest that once covered our region that is only, just coming back. I think, as I mentioned, there are so many programming possibilities in trying to demonstrate, as Kristin alluded to, the richness of these ecosystems. So, when we think about longleaf forests, it's not just the trees, but these understories and the diverse wildlife that flourishes in them. The reason they exist on private lands is they're quail hunting grounds. And so the quail has to be able to prosper in those spaces too. So thinking about these trees, not as just these singular isolated animate things, but as part of a larger system, as part of, as connected to other wildlife, and as connected to the human beings who have either cared for them or not over the course of the life of these forests. And then of course, these the paintings themselves are just beautiful, rich surfaces, and really, they demand this kind of this close looking that you almost, and they're, because of how large they are, and we'll have the three large landscapes, the three large canvases that you see behind Kristin in her studio, as well as several smaller pieces, and that play between large and small, pulling the visitor in and out of viewing these paintings, hopefully adds to this effort to really immerse the visitor in that world. So, those are just some of the things, but there's always layers and layers that we're trying to, bring the visitor from one to the next as the story expands in any encounter with a work of art.
Yeah, and as Jeff mentioned, this forest was 90 million acres. So it was sort of the southeast of Virginia, the Dismal Swamp area, going all the way down into central Florida, and then across into East Texas. And I'd say that, there are these pockets of people. There's some in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Just foresters that are really on the front lines of this. And as he said, have brought it up to, I think it's about 4 million acres now. And really working with the landowners to make these very long range plans in their wills with their family members to continue to protect what's left. But I definitely want to say that every forest I've been to, I have been lucky enough to have a forester as a guide. And in this forest, a man named Paul Massey, who was the mentee of Leon Neal, who was the mentee of Herbert Stoddard, and they developed the Stoddard-Neal approach to managing forests. And there's a wonderful book out called The Art of Managing Longleafs, and it's a coincidentally a University of Georgia Press publication. So it's available still, but that really takes you through from a forester standpoint on how in modern times they are preserving forests. And it's been incredibly helpful to me to read all of that and understand it.
Yeah, and I think, the other takeaway here is, is it really a question to the visitor, which would be, based on this experience with the work and with this history, what is our responsibility? What is our responsibility to these landscapes, to these forests? And Kristin mentioned some of these foresters doing very important work, including, the use of burn cycles to be sustaining these forests. And I think there are elements of fire, of scorched surface, and the longleaf being so well known for having this incredibly resilient, thick bark surface, which Kristin's paintings capture so well. I mean, I think the sustaining of these forests is part of the pictures and is part of the larger story and the larger takeaway, which is, again, what is our responsibility as viewers, as visitors, as residents of these regions, as citizens.
Yeah, and how are we going to take care of them if we don't even know about them, right? So that's been my big thing, is just, already with a small Instagram following, I'm having conversations with people about forests all the time now. And it's just like my little small part, but I think if that's really such a huge piece of what he was talking about, of just, having people educated so that they know how to somehow help, right? Whether it's, buying land if they have the resources and doing this. I know, the person that owns the land that I researched on bought it in her 90s. This was her way of giving back and preserving something that was meaningful in her life. So, there's a lot of, people who can caretake land in the world and have the resources to do it. And I hope to connect with as many of them as I can. Because I can't imagine owning anything more magical and amazing than forests, right?
Great. How do you think the project will inspire conversations about climate change?
Well, as Jeff mentioned about the controlled burns, I arrived there about 6 weeks after a controlled burn, and it was incredible. It had already grown back, the understory. It was probably 8 inches tall and thick and green. And then I live in California, who, because of population reasons, does not practice regular controlled burns as much as, would be advisable. I mean, there's places like Yosemite where I remember I had a conversation with one of the foresters there and just saying, is it possible to actually have everybody vacate the valley and burn it the way the Miwoks did hundreds of years ago, to help all the different trees and all the, especially the oaks, which are really suffering right now with the drought. But there's so many things I've just witnessed over a 10-year period. A lot of the trees I worked on in California have been decimated by fire. I think there's only 2 giant oaks that I worked with that are still alive. So that's been kind of an indicator for me, is here you have these trees that are hundreds of years old, and out of the dozens I've worked with, as far as my research currently only 2 of them are still standing and healthy. So yeah, all I can do is report back, right? And hope that that information informs and inspires people to take action in everybody's small little way, right? Like that's all it's gonna take is just everybody doing their part.
Yeah, and I mentioned the scale of Kristin's paintings. I mean, they're roughly what, 6 feet across? Is that right?
Yeah.
And so I think there's 2 different scales at play here, you know, especially when we think about the challenge of conveying the message of you know, the urgent message of the state of our planet is that it can sometimes be too big of a problem to understand. How do we make it immediate? How do we make it tangible? And so, you know, there is a global story here. If we think about longleaf, another devastating fire that happened just within the last few years was at Notre Dame in Paris, and you know, the timber attic, the timber roofing structure of Notre Dame was built with these old growth trees that no longer exist anywhere in Europe. Those forests that they were timbered from are gone. So how do you rebuild that cathedral? Well, Kristin, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you mentioned that they were in conversations with longleaf pine foresters about potentially using some of those old growth trees to help rebuild the wooden attic and roof structure of that cathedral. So this points to a global crisis. You know, there is no wood left like this in Europe to be had. But also, you know, if we think about the immediate, the local, I mean, this focusing on these bark patterns and, you know, what is conveyed on the surface of these paintings. This is the skin, this is the membrane of the tree. This is kind of, and this is the place where we have our contact with it, that, you know, where it was tapped for turpentine, where, you know, it was, you know, what you touched and held when you were you know, cutting it down. This is the charred surface of the burn. And so, you know, you're having to tell both sides of those stories, or this story through these paintings. And I think that's kind of what they do so wonderfully.
Yeah, thank you. And in California, it was the xylem. So it's the whole vascular tissue of the tree. So again, letting the tree speak for itself has been one way for me to tell the story and help with the whole conversation.
Okay, great. And from doing this project, have you found a favorite tree species?
I'd have to say the longleaf is right up there. And I love the whole ecosystem. And there's so many different endangered species that live in it. Like when I was there were gopher tortoises. So part of the forest that was very sandy, they were all very happy and thriving there. And there's incredible amount of snakes. The ivory-billed woodpecker, which just was officially named an extinct bird, used to live in these woods. And there's a very rigorous program going on with the red cockaded woodpecker, who is living there and thriving, and especially loves to burrow, and nest in heart pine. So with heart pine being more scarce, ornithologists are creating different man-made boxes that they're installing into the trees, and that program seems to be thriving, and they're nesting away in them. So all of it's been so interesting, and I love California oaks, but I'd say it's a tie with the longleaf.
Right, great. Well, those were all the questions I had for you. Do either of you have some concluding remarks? All right.
Actually, Samantha, I have a question. I'm going to circle back to the beginning. And Jeff, you said it, and I thought I must have misheard. So we're going to circle back to longleaf pine versus longleaf line with an L. Can you bring me back to that and how you all developed that?
Well, titles are hard.
They're very hard.
So yes, the exhibition that will open in July of 2022 here in Georgia will be called Kristin Leachman Longleaf Lines. It's intentionally a play on longleaf pine, the rhyme of those words, but thinking about all the different meanings of that phrase. A longleaf line is, the rendering of that tree on the surface of a canvas. It's about making, it's about this response to these natural forms, and really, trying to bring attention to these pictures themselves as, dancing on this line between the abstract and representational. Samantha said, I don't see human beings in these pictures. Are they figurative, or are they representational? Well, yes, they are, but they're also clearly thinking about abstraction and abstract painting. But then line, as I said, having these other connotations, like with the railroad, and just trying to find a phrase that gets to the tensions that are all part of the history of these forests, because they are magical and beautiful, but they also are, they bear on on their bark, they bear the scars of history, whether it's thinking about those scars as, destruction that is generative, like these fires, right? That fire can create and it doesn't just destroy. So we went around and around on the title, but I think we landed on something that at least starts those conversations around the bigger histories of these places and how Kristin's paintings intervene in that history.
Yeah, and I think that was something Jeff and I both had a lot of passion for, was just how many kind of interconnected stories there were that were major American stories. They also started timbering near rivers so that they could get the lumber down. And a lot of the logs were lost. And there are people now scuba diving to bring up those logs, which have been preserved underwater, which is amazing. And because they're old growth, they haven't been rotted away, and they're taking them to dry out in sawmills and using the wood. But that's a big business right now. Also, I thought was incredible was the Lower Creek tribe leader told me that the Lower Creek were the first architects of the log cabin, because they used longleaf pine logs to make their homes, and that's the original cabin design. And I just, the whole idea of the naval stores in England and using all of the wood for shipbuilding. And they obviously they're super straight and tall, and the ship masts, and it's such a visual story. And I think as an artist, I really responded to that as well. And then as I said, I've loved this the painting of the interconnected, interlocking bark formations. It's been so fun to paint. I've loved working on it. So yeah, I hope that people will come and pass through Georgia and see the show when it's up.
Thank you. Thank you, all three of you. Thank you, Samantha, for hosting this conversation. And thank you, Kristin and Jeff, for bringing this conversation and all of the research and connections you both are making to the history and the ecosystem it's really very impressive, and I'm very happy we got the opportunity to learn about this and speak with you both today. Thank you.
Thanks, Morgan.
Yeah.
Thank you, Samantha.
Yeah, thank you all for your time.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.